Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to witness the scary Tet night when Tuna's fever won't break, and Alex makes one urgent decision that could change everything for her and baby Henry. If you enjoy the story, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The small room was lit by a dim yellow bulb that made everything feel heavier. Tuna lay on the bed, shaking under a blanket that couldn't warm her. Her breathing came in shallow, broken gasps. Fever had turned her skin burning hot and her bones cold at the same time. Her forehead throbbed. Her head pounded like someone was striking metal inside her skull. When she opened her eyes, the ceiling blurred in and out, as if the world refused to stay still. Alex stood beside the bed, posture rigid with worry. He reached out and pressed the back of his hand to her forehead, then again, as if hoping the heat would disappear the second time. Tuna, he said, voice low, thick. How are you feeling? Tuna tried to answer, but her throat felt dry and tight. The words came out faint. My head, it's still terrible, she whispered. It hurts so much. Alex's jaw clenched. He'd been waiting for the fever to break, telling himself it was just one more hour, one more cup of warm water, one more dose of medicine. But the fever didn't care. It stayed like a shadow. He didn't hesitate anymore. We're going to the hospital, he said, already turning. Tuna's eyes widened weakly. Now? Yes, Alex replied. Right now. He moved fast, but careful, like any sudden motion could hurt her more. He went to Henry first. The baby was asleep, cheeks soft, tiny hands curled. Alex hated waking him, but he had no choice. He lifted Henry gently into his arms. Henry stirred, made a small, confused sound, then began to cry. That cry pierced the room and made Tuna's guilt surge harder than the fever. She struggled to sit up as Alex helped her, one arm around her shoulders. Her body felt heavy, like it didn't belong to her. She leaned into him, shaking. I'm bothering you so much, she whispered, voice cracking. It's almost Tet, and you're still here taking care of me. Alex shook his head immediately. His eyes were steady, resolute, like he refused to let her carry even that guilt. It's all right, he said. You're so sick. I can't leave you alone like this. Henry's cries softened when Alex pressed him closer, rocking lightly without thinking. Alex glanced at the baby, then back at Tuna. His worry split in two, Tuna's fever and Henry's needs. He knew he couldn't bring a fragile baby into a chaotic night without support. He reached for his phone and called his mother. When she answered, Alex's voice stayed calm, but urgency sat underneath every word. He explained quickly, Tuna's fever wouldn't break. He was taking her to the hospital. He needed someone to watch Henry. His mother didn't ask questions. She just said, bring him here. I'll take care of him. Alex exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. He gathered what they needed with deliberate speed. Tuna's ID, her papers, a small bag, Henry's essentials. Every movement was controlled, but inside him, pressure rose like a flood. He couldn't afford mistakes tonight. Not with Tuna shaking beside him. Not with Henry crying in his arms. Tuna watched him from the edge of the bed, a wave of helplessness washing over her. Tet was supposed to be warmth, family, reunion. Instead, it was the weakest moment of her life. Fever, darkness, and the fear of collapsing with no one there. But Alex was there, a steady anchor in the storm. He came back to her, knelt beside her, and cupped her hand gently. Rest a bit while I pack, he murmured. Then I'll take you. Tuna nodded weakly. Her eyes closed for a second, and in that darkness, she wondered quietly, painfully, what she and Henry would have done without him during these holiday days. When they finally got outside, the air felt cold and sharp against Tuna's skin. Alex moved her into the car carefully, then strapped Henry in for the short drive to his mother's house. Henry had quieted now, exhausted from crying, tiny breaths hiccuping in his sleep. Tuna stared at him, guilt and love mixing inside her chest until she couldn't tell which one hurt more. At Alex's mother's home, The older woman took Henry immediately, pressing a kiss to his forehead and promising softly, "Don't worry, I've got him." Tuna's eyes stung. She whispered, "Thank you." But her voice was too weak to carry the full meaning. Alex didn't linger. He turned back to Tuna, helped her into the car again, and drove straight to the hospital. The hospital lights were brutal, white and harsh, exposing every tremble in Tuna's hands, every strain in Alex's face. They checked in, waited, spoke to nurses, filled out forms. Alex stayed close, one hand on Tuna's shoulder, one hand holding papers. His mind running calculations the way it always did, but now the numbers were replaced by symptoms, minutes, breaths, and the terrifying question, what if I'm too late? Tuna was admitted, medicine was given, fluids, rest. The fever didn't vanish instantly, but the edge softened, her breathing steadied. The room became quieter, and then Tet passed in sterile walls. Days later, early spring sunlight slipped through the hospital window blinds and fell softly across Tuna's face. She lay on the bed with a book in her hands, the pages open but her mind drifting. Her skin looked less pale now. Her eyes were clearer, not fully bright yet, but present. Memories of the past days flooded back her fever. Alex's hands on her forehead, Henry's cry, the rush to the hospital, the feeling of being carried when she couldn't carry herself. She swallowed hard, emotion rising. I was so lucky Alex was here throughout Tet, she whispered to herself. The thought hit her like a wave. Tet was supposed to be a time when families gathered everywhere. If Alex hadn't been there, if she had faced this sickness alone, how lost would she and Henry have been? Tuna stared out the window. In her mind, she saw Alex cradling Henry, tired but smiling, patient and steady. She remembered how he'd entrusted Henry to his mother, how he'd stayed beside Tuna through the long hours, how he'd never once made her feel like a burden. Warmth bloomed in her chest like a small flame. Not romantic fantasy, something deeper, safety, care, proof that she wasn't invisible. I'm truly fortunate to have met him, she told herself. And for the first time in a long time, she believed it, without doubt. Her health stabilized gradually. The hospital no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a marker, proof she had survived a hard point and could step forward again. She turned the pages of her book slowly, absorbing words like they carried meaning beyond the paper. And with each page, a quiet resolve formed. Once she fully recovered, she would pick up Henry. She would thank Mrs. Tang and Alex's mother properly. She would return to the market, gather what she needed, sell what she could. Life had to go on, and she would live better, partly for Henry, partly to honor the man who had saved her from being swallowed by sickness and loneliness. The guilt she'd felt about bothering Alex began to dissolve. In its place remained something steadier, appreciation, a deep gratitude that didn't beg or apologize. It simply existed. Tuna smiled faintly and looked ahead, imagining a future where hope sprouted like tender green shoots after rain. A few mornings later, the farm woke up under a calm sky. Roosters crowed somewhere in the distance, and the sound didn't feel harsh the way it sometimes did. It felt normal, familiar, like life had decided to offer Tuna a gentle restart. In the small kitchen, Tuna stirred porridge for Henry, the spoon moving in slow circles. Steam rose and filled the room with a comforting smell that pushed away the last cold memory of hospital disinfectant. Her body felt stronger now. The fever was gone. The tremble in her hands had faded. But the hospital days still hovered in her mind like passing clouds, close enough to remind her what could have happened. Henry slept soundly nearby, cheeks rosy, lips slightly parted. Tuna watched him for a moment, love and quiet worry swelling in her chest. He had been so good while she was ill, too small to understand, yet somehow patient, as if he could feel the tension and decided not to add to it. Today, she decided she would return to her routine, not because she was fully ready, but because the world didn't wait. She would leave Henry with Mrs. Tang for a while, then go gather items to sell at the market. The rhythm of survival was calling her back. On the table, her book lay open, the same book she'd held in the hospital. Tu-na touched the cover and smiled softly. "I'll read more tonight," she murmured, like a promise to herself. She cleaned the house slowly, not rushing the way she used to. She folded blankets, wiped counters, arranged Henry's small items neatly. Each simple action felt like claiming her life back piece by piece. Tet had passed. People were returning to work. The familiar rhythms were returning too, and instead of feeling trapped by them, Tu-na felt steadied. She thought of Alex, of his mother, of the way they had cared for Henry without hesitation, of Alex's steady presence during her weakest hours. The fear of illness was still there, scar tissue in the mind, but it no longer ruled her. In its place was hope. A more stable life, a stronger Henry, a Tu-na who could stand on her own but didn't have to stand alone. Henry woke with a small sound. Tu-na lifted him gently, kissed his forehead, and whispered into his soft hair, "Mommy's better now, my love." Sunlight streamed into the little garden outside. Some flowers had wilted while she was sick. Tu-na looked at them through the window and felt a quiet determination rise. "I'll tend to you again," she thought, "just like I'll tend to my own life." Everything was reviving slowly, surely, and inside her, gratitude burned steady, like an eternal flame. Not long after, Alex stood before the camera. The background was simple, quiet, the kind of space that told viewers he wasn't performing, he was updating them honestly. His eyes looked sincere, his voice deep and warm, filling the room. "I know we've been absent for 10 days, he said. Tu-na was seriously ill. Her health made it impossible for us to film." He paused, letting the words land. There was a trace of regret in his tone, not for the algorithm or the schedule, but for the worry their viewers might have felt. "Neither of us wanted this to happen," he continued. "But Tu-na has fully recovered now, and we're back at the farm." He thanked the audience for their messages. Those caring words, he said, became motivation, something that pushed them to return sooner. He promised they would upload regularly moving forward and asked for continued support. Then, in a small gesture that made everything feel real, he picked up his phone and called Tu-na. Her voice came through brighter than it had been in days. "I'm much better now," she said. "Thank you so much for helping me and our child." Alex smiled, relief washing over him in a way he didn't try to hide. "I'm just happy I could take care of you," he replied. They spoke briefly about the first workday of the year, about rest, about not pushing too hard. Tu-na reminded him to take care of himself too, and Alex promised he would. When the call ended, Alex looked into the distance, and something unusual settled in his expression. Warmth. The past days had been heavy, worrying for Tu-na, managing work, feeling the audience waiting. But now, things were falling into place again. Alex told himself he had to try harder, not only as a CEO, but as a man who didn't want the people he loved to suffer alone. Hope flickered in his eyes like dawn after long rain. He left the farm and headed to work. After Tet, the starch factory buzzed back to life like a heartbeat restarting. Machines hummed steadily, belts rolled. Workers moved with practiced rhythm. The air smelled of raw material, oil, and New Year beginnings. Alex walked in and greeted the secretary with a warm smile. "Wishing you a joyful and healthy New Year," he said. She returned the greeting immediately and reported smoothly around 20 tons of starch remained in inventory. New Year bonuses had already been distributed to motivate the workers. Alex nodded, approving. He didn't smile the way he did in boardrooms. His smile here was quieter, more grounded. "Good," he said. "Have the workers pack and ship immediately." He inspected equipment, checked the line, instructed a thorough cleaning and sanitization. He wanted everything ready for full production restart. As he walked, relief settled in him, seeing stability, but pressure lingered in the back of his mind. Local timber supply would last only 2 to 3 more months. That fact, sat like a stone in his pocket. Before leaving the office, Alex presented a small gift to the secretary as thanks. His eyes were sincere. "You've been a great partner to the company," he said. The secretary looked surprised, then touched. Alex didn't linger. His mind was already on the next step: new suppliers, farther areas, securing orders so production wouldn't stop. He headed to the wood chipping plant. The plant carried the fresh scent of timber. Distant saws hummed like a constant low note. Alex stepped inside and inspected stacks of new wood, eyes serious but composed. He questioned technicians about machinery status still under inspection, expected to finish this afternoon or tomorrow. "Hurry it up," Alex instructed, voice low but firm. "We need enough for the first order of the year." Local timber was running low, 2 to 3 months, maybe less if demand rose. Pressure mounted. New sources had to be secured, distant areas surveyed, contracts stabilized. Alex wished the workers a happy new year, thanking them for last year's support. "Wishing everyone good health," he said, "so we can grow together." He directed removal of leftover waste to clear space for incoming shipments. He moved through the plant with steady steps, but his mind raced with calculations. The new year was not only a beginning, it was a test. Preserving jobs, fulfilling orders, maintaining stability for the people who depended on him. And now, those people weren't only employees. They were Tuna and Henry waiting at the farm. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating neatly stacked logs like symbols of perseverance. Alex paused for a moment, breathing in the crisp wood-scented air, and thought of Tuna's smile after recovery. The memory strengthened his resolve. Hope and anxiety twisted together, but he knew he wasn't alone, supported by his team, by Tuna, by the future. Late afternoon settled over the farm when Alex finally returned. The sunset painted the reviving garden in gold. Tuna was outside, watering wilted flowers with gentle care, like she was soothing painful memories. Henry woke and cried softly, and Tuna lifted him for fresh air. Then she heard it. "Tuna." She turned, and her eyes lit up. "You're back." Alex walked toward her quickly, worry on his face before joy could hide it. He asked about her health, almost scolding her for returning to work too soon, but the happiness of seeing her standing there alive, steady, overpowered everything. Henry clapped his hands and giggled at the sight of Uncle Alex. They talked quietly. Alex shared updates, hill surveys, grapefruit orchards, price negotiations, strange weather. Then he suggested taking the whole family out tomorrow or the day after, including Henry. Tuna hesitated immediately. "Won't it affect your work?" Alex shook his head. "I arranged everything." Tuna's eyes filled with emotion. She thanked Mrs. Tang and Alex's mother for helping without condition. Alex held Henry, playing gently, then looked at Tuna with a tenderness that felt almost frightening in its honesty. "You're my girlfriend," he said. "If anything happened to you, I wouldn't know how to go on." Tuna's eyes welled. "I'm so grateful to you," she whispered. She invited him to stay for dinner. Alex agreed immediately, smiling like the answer had been waiting all day. He helped water the flowers. He watched Henry. A child's laughter mixed with whispered affection as dusk deepened. Tuna looked at Alex and felt hope overflow after the storm of illness. They had found peace together. The flame of their bond burned brighter than before, promising that this new year could be different. Tuna collapses with a relentless fever as Tet approaches, trembling in a dim room while Alex anxiously checks her burning forehead. When her headache and fever won't break, Alex decides immediately to take her to the hospital while arranging for his mother to watch baby Henry. Tuna feels guilty for bothering him during the holiday, but Alex refuses to leave her alone. After Tet passes in sterile hospital walls, Tuna stabilizes and realizes how lucky she was to have Alex beside her, caring for her and ensuring Henry was safe. Back on the farm, she regains strength, cooks porridge, cleans, and prepares to return to market work, carrying deep gratitude. Alex updates viewers about their 10-day absence, thanks them, and calls Tuna on camera to confirm her recovery. He returns to work at the starch factory and wood chipping plant, facing supply pressure while staying determined for Tuna and Henry. At sunset, he comes back to the farm, worries over her health, and the family's hope rekindles.